Welcome back, everyone. So today we've got a fantastic, highly requested explainer for you. We're going to capture the absolute essentials of the all-about history book of U.S. presidents in 8 minutes or less. We're diving right into the history, the triumphs, and, the trials of the highest office in the United States. So get focused, because we are packing over 2 centuries of wild history into one tight visual journey. Okay, let's dive into this. Just think about the central paradox of the American presidency for a second. The Founding Fathers had literally just fought a brutal war to escape the tyranny of a British king, right? So how on earth did they end up creating one of the most powerful, concentrated executive offices in human history? That tension, between being absolutely terrified of a monarch and desperately needing a leader, that's basically the DNA of the presidency. Part 1. Birth of the Presidency. From colony to constitution. Now, the American Revolution definitely wasn't some overnight event. It was actually the culmination of almost 3 centuries of buildup. Starting all the way back with Columbus landing in 1492, then moving to the first permanent English settlement in Jamestown in 1607, and the Mayflower Pilgrims in 1620. Fast forward over 150 years, and those frustrations finally boil over with the Boston Tea Party in 1773, protesting those British tea taxes. By 1775, shots are literally fired at Lexington and Concord, and the revolution violently breaks out. They sever ties with Great Britain, sure, but man, that left a massive void in leadership. So, their very first attempt at a government was the Articles of Confederation, but it was incredibly weak. Congress couldn't enforce laws, they couldn't collect taxes, state delegates often didn't even bother showing up to vote. The real breaking point we see on our sources happened in 1786. A group of Massachusetts farmers rebelled over debt, and the central government was completely powerless to stop it. They could do nothing. This totally forced the delegates' hands, pushing them to convene in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the U.S. Constitution, realizing, hey, we absolutely need a strong central executive to hold this whole thing together. Part 2. The precedent setters, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. Unanimously elected in 1789, George Washington was the ultimate precedent setter. The sources really point out his unmatched virtue here. He could have easily held on to power indefinitely. In fact, King George III even remarked that if Washington actually gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And you know what? That's exactly what he did. By stepping down after 2 terms, he set this unwritten rule that stuck around all the way until 1940. And here's a fascinating, kind of complex detail from the text. Far from the simple myths, Washington was a slave-owning planter. But in his final will, he actually freed all of his slaves. Next up was John Adams, our second president. Adams was this brilliant political mind whose family traced all the way back to the first generation of Puritan settlers. And he had a really prescient view of what they were actually building. His quote about the Declaration of Independence is just striking. "I can't but consider it an epocha in history." He understood right off the bat that their little experiment in democracy was going to alter the entire course of human events, literally laying the groundwork for the exact political system we're living in today. Which brings us to number 3, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, famous for those massive words, "all men are created equal," a phrase that was actually edited into the preamble by Benjamin Franklin, funnily enough. But what's really incredible to learn from our sources here, the drafting process was heavily edited. Actually, Congress removed nearly a quarter of Jefferson's original draft before they finally ratified it. Kind of wild to think about, right? Part 3, Symbols and Systems. The architecture of executive power. So, the U.S. Constitution creates this highly deliberate balancing act. On one side, you've got the legislative branch, Congress. It's bicameral, which just means 2 houses, 100 senators and 435 representatives, making 535 people who debate, vote, and actually make the laws. But then, on the other side, you have the executive branch, the president. Just one person, one singular commander-in-chief tasked with executing those laws. It is a massive concentration of power, strategically balanced right against a broad legislative body. Now, what's really interesting about this is the hidden symbolism built right into the presidential seal. The seal actually wasn't officially used on White House invitations until Rutherford B. Hayes did it in 1877. If you look closely at the design, it's like a giant puzzle. 13 stars around the eagle's head, 13 clouds, 13 arrows clutched in one talon signifying protection, and an olive branch with 13 olives and 13 leaves in the other signifying peace. It's a constant, brilliant visual callback to those original 13 colonies. And the motto, E pluribus unum, literally translates to one out of many, pretty much the perfect summary of a federal government. Part 4, A Nation Divided, the breaking point of the Union. This particularly dark period was overseen by our 15th president, James Buchanan. Interestingly enough, Buchanan is the only president to have remained a lifelong bachelor, but his time in office was totally defined by a fracturing nation. Sectional tensions over slavery were reaching an absolute boiling point. As we see in the source text, the devastating Dred Scott decision by the courts, which Buchanan actually supported, accelerated the nation's path straight into civil war. It left just a frightening political mess for the guy coming next. Which brings us to the 16th president, and a question that is heavily debated by historians: was Abraham Lincoln the greatest U.S. president ever? I mean, when Lincoln took the oath of office, the Union he was literally sworn to protect was already breaking apart. He inherited absolute chaos and the immense, crushing burden of navigating a country that was actively going to war with itself. And that chaos completely exploded right here. At 4:30 in the morning in April of 1861, cannon batteries stationed around the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina, launched salvo after salvo onto a small island outpost. This harrowing bombardment of Fort Sumter was the literal spark that ignited the American Civil War. The national flag fell, and the deadliest conflict in American history officially began. But Lincoln not only preserved the Union through this incredibly agonizing war, he fundamentally shifted the entire moral weight of the presidency. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which began the legal end of slavery, he laid the framework for what he famously called a new birth of freedom. He showed everyone that the presidency could be a tool for immense moral reform, proving that executive power can be used to actively reshape human rights. Part 5, The Modern Oval Office, Expanding Responsibilities. A perfect example of this ever-expanding domestic power is Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ was a total master of the legislative process. Our sources highlight his highly consequential, though definitely sometimes complicated, partnership with civil rights trailblazer Martin Luther King Jr. Together, despite having some differing approaches, they achieved monumental change. Most notably, they secured equal voting rights for Black Americans, which was just a massive use of executive and legislative power to totally reshape American society. Bringing our timeline all the way into the modern era, we look at the 44th president, Barack Obama. Making history as the first Black president of the United States, Obama's election represented another massive milestone. Inheriting an economy that was in the depths of a severe recession and navigating 2 ongoing wars, his 2 terms really showcase the immense global responsibilities of the modern Oval Office. His most lasting achievement, as noted in the text, was the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, pushing through major healthcare reform despite some really fierce opposition. So from a fragile experiment hiding from a king to an office that literally shapes the global economy and healthcare for millions, the evolution of executive power is just absolutely astounding. The presidency is this living, breathing institution that adapts to whatever era it serves. Which kind of makes you wonder, with the rapid pace of technological and global change today, what is the power of the presidency going to look like 100 years from now? If you enjoyed this, subscribe to In 8 Minutes and never miss what matters.